Striker here. I'm here to read part 2 of chapter 26, Destiny Calls. "Hello, Butt," said Frederick. "Fancy a stroll?" "No, thank you, I'm rather busy," is what I meant to say, but that's not what came out of my swollen lips. It was more like, "No, thank you, I thank you, sissy," and drool ran down my face. Frederick laughed. "I didn't think you could get any uglier. Tie him up." Bruno knelt down and grabbed my puffy hands to tie them together. He had a time of it, though. My hands were so fat that it was almost impossible to get my wrists together. Finally, he tied me at the elbows, which was probably the only place the pixies didn't bite. "We've missed you so much, Butt," said Frederick, and he patted my swollen face. I winced. Bruno laughed. "Father misses you too, and so does our sister, the Queen." I was afraid they were going to tell me she'd had the baby, but they didn't. I breathed. As long as she didn't have a baby or I didn't hear of it, there was a way out of this. Of course the miller wanted me to spin gold for him, but I didn't have to. I wouldn't, not for anything. They dragged me out of the trees and then marched me down the road in the direction I had already been traveling, but definitely not where I wanted to go. I knew this was very serious. Frederick and Bruno were kidnapping me at knife point. I should have been terrified, but I couldn't think of any of that because I was seething mad at the swarm of pixies and at Red's granny for her vague advice. I had sausage fingers. I could barely see. I was drooling out of my fat lips, and my butt was lopsided. It's all very awkward to walk with a lopsided bottom. As I waddled down the road, my heart swelled with sadness. I could say that none of it mattered, that I should just give up and let the tangles keep wrapping until they covered the top of my head and pushed me down into the earth. What did matter? That Frederick and Bruno had captured me? What did it matter? That they were talking to me and taking me to the miller who wanted me to spin him gold forever? But in my heart it mattered. I didn't want to be trapped. I wanted to grow. I wanted to break free. When the sun set, we stopped to camp, and I was tied to a tree near the road. I was actually grateful to sit in the snow and ice. It soothed my sore, sorry rump, but I was also starving, and I watched hungrily as Frederick and Bruno tore through my satchel and ate all the food I had packed. They threw me a chunk of bread, which I had to bend down to eat it off the dirt like a dog. Frederick commanded Bruno to guard me. When they were together, Bruno did whatever his brother told him, but by himself, he was meaner than Frederick. Maybe he was only mean to me because other people made him feel small and he wanted to prove that he was big. I suddenly felt sorry for Bruno in a way I never had, and Frederick too, because he probably felt small around the miller, and the miller probably felt small around someone else, like King Barf. But I didn't feel too sorry. Bruno might feel smaller than me even, but I didn't think meanness was ever in anyone's destiny. Meanness was a choice. At first, we only sat in silence, but then Bruno grew bored. He laughed and poked at my swollen face. "They made a good breakfast of you, didn't they?" He laughed and laughed until he fell on the snow and sputtered at the cold shock. As darkness fell, it grew very cold. I sat shivering against the tree while Frederick wrapped himself in a thick woolen blanket. Bruno tried to do the same, but Frederick yanked his blanket away. "Keep watching, Butt," he commanded. "He's tied up tight enough," whined Bruno. I said, "Watch him." Bruno faced me and glowered, but as soon as Frederick was asleep, he wrapped himself in his blanket and curled up by the fire. "Good night, Butt," Bruno whispered loudly, and then joined his brother in snoring slumber. I waited and shivered. Everything was quiet. The fire was dead, and there was only a sliver of moonlight to see. It was impossible to sleep because I was so cold and with swollen pixie bites. So I stayed awake thinking about my destiny, and when I got tired of that, I cursed pixies and gnomes, but mostly pixies. But then a miracle happened. During the night, my swelling started to go down, helped by the cool air, I guess, and as it went down, my bindings loosened. I wriggled, but it wasn't quite enough to get me free. I deflated a little more every hour, and I wriggled, and Frederick and Bruno snored on. Just as the sky was fading from black to purple, my hands and arms were almost back to normal, and they slipped out of the ropes. I praise the pixies. I wish they had bitten me 100 more times and made me as fat as the miller. Beautiful, lovely pixies. It's funny how some things you think are so terrible can turn out to be really wonderful. I love my swollen arms and fingers and my lopsided butt. Something rustled in the bushes, probably just a squirrel or a rabbit, but it made Bruno stop snoring. He smacked his lips and pulled his covers tighter around him. I moved as fast and as quietly as I could, with my arms free. I was able to wriggle myself out of the rest of the ropes. Just as I pulled the last rope over my head, the rustling noise came again, and from the shrubs appeared a gnome. He was hopping with great excitement. Greetings from the kingdom. King Bartholomew, Archibald, Renifold, Fife, and Queen Opal both happily announced the birth of their new son, heir to the throne of the kingdom. His name is... I clamped my hands over the gnome's mouth, but it was too late. I had heard exactly what I didn't want to hear, and Frederick and Bruno were awake now, staring bleary-eyed between the gnome and me. I dropped the gnome, scrambled to my feet, and ran. Except I ran in exactly the opposite direction from where I wished to go. I had freed myself from Frederick and Bruno's ropes, but the ropes that had been tangled and knotted inside of me were now tugging at me, pulling me like a stubborn donkey in the direction of the kingdom. It was time to collect on my worst bargain ever. And that is the end of chapter 26. Bye.